Welcome to LATV, Leominster Access Television, and Neighborhood Snapshot. My name is Bob Sardelli. I am a member of the Leominster Historical Commission. Today we welcome to LATV Mr. Keith Lauer, longtime Leominster resident, historian, businessman, public servant. Mr. Lauer was associated with my scout troop when I was a young fellow. That's the first time I met Mr. Lauer. And Mr. Lauer is also a plastorian. He'll explain that word, a word which he has coined. And just a moment ago, he told me about that word, and so we'll hear more about that in a bit. Welcome, Keith. Welcome to LATV.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Keith, where were you born?
In Marietta, Ohio.
Marietta, Ohio. So you're not a native of Leominster. When were you born?
March the 3rd, 1922.
1922. Where were your parents born?
My mother was born in Reno, Ohio, I believe, which was a little community near Marietta. And my father was born in the township. And that's another story. But
so even though you were not born in Leominster, you are known, you're a well-known Leominster resident. When did you come to Leominster? How did you, tell us something about how you came to Leominster and when you came to Leominster.
Well, at one time I was accepted at Ohio University, not Ohio State, and that's in Athens, Ohio. And there was a college professor going down south, and he came in from a trip to the east, and he wanted to know if he asked my mother if I could help with the driving. And she said, well, I think he'd be glad to go with you and help with the driving. So he got in on a plane. That was quite a thing in those days. And we were a few miles outside of Marietta on our way to Alabama, and he fell asleep, and he said, you better drive. Well, I drove the rest of the way to Alabama. So I ended up in Athens, Alabama, rather than Athens, Ohio. And while there, for 2 years, I met a girl from Leominster who had come up from her aunt's home in Florida in the summer. So we started the fall together in Athens, Alabama. And we both were there for 2 years. So my third year I was back home in Marietta, and I was 6 weeks into the fall semester. And my father was the clerk of the local draft board. And he said, your number came up and you're going into the service. He said, I'm the clerk of the draft board. So I went into the service. And where did they ship me? Right back to Alabama, to Fort McClellan. So I saw a little of the country.
What branch of the service were you in?
I was a combat infantryman through Europe.
In World War II?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your service.
Well, thank you.
Sincerely. And to all the veterans in the audience who have served. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of you people. Thank you, Keith, and everyone.
Well, I'm lucky to be here.
Keith, you got to Leominster in 1947.
Yeah, correct.
And you were out of college then.
Yep.
The war was over.
Yes.
And were you married at that time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you and your wife came to Leominster.
Well, this was her home.
This was her home.
Yes.
And where in Leominster? At what particular neighborhood? What particular section of the city?
I don't know what title they've given the area. Every area seems to have a signpost, but I was on North Main Street, on the corner of North Main Street and Richardson, and on one side of the intersection was my in-laws' home, and I was on the other side of Richardson Street on the corner.
And in the waiting room, you had mentioned you had some, you got to know some, who were some of your neighbors?
There were quite a few in the immediate area. Jimmy DiGeronimo Sr. was my next door neighbor.
Senior, yeah.
A wonderful neighbor and a fine man.
And you got to know some of the other DiGeronimo children?
Oh yes,
yeah.
Oh yes, Dottie and all of the family.
And these are the DiGeronimos associated with the Victory Market, which has such a long history in Leominster and the area.
Oh yes.
You told me something very, very interesting. The place where on North Main Street where the former Victory executive offices were located, and there was a Victory Market there, but then it became the Victory executive offices.
Correct.
When that building wasn't there when you came to Leominster.
Oh, no.
What was there? There's something very, very interesting about the history of Leominster and the region.
Well, you and I have probably seen maps of Leominster indicating things were located. And on the maps there was a symbol for the greenhouses.
I've seen that particular map.
From the Victory executive offices down to the confluence of the railroad and North Main Street almost, that was all greenhouses.
Greenhouses. I have actually seen an old reproduction of a glass negative of that showing some of the greenhouses.
Correct.
And the exposure to the sun was perfect apparently for growing things. And tell us something about that.
They were heated.
Heated?
There was a heating plant, and I think to kill the insects that also existed in the greenhouses, they would hang bundles of tobacco leaves up from the ceiling, and the steam from the heating plant was focused on the tobacco leaves, and that kept the insects off of the cucumber plants.
Interestingly, I know that nicotine, which is in tobacco, is also used, I think, as an insecticide.
Right.
So that was probably the connection there.
Correct.
There were lots of greenhouses in Leominster and the region. And what did a Mr. Kendall have to do with this? You mentioned the name Kendall Greenhouses.
Well, I guess he was one of the pioneers. And in those days, you couldn't buy some vegetables and products of the ground until they had greenhouses. And I think most of them in Leominster, you've seen old maps, I'm sure, they were scattered all over Leominster. And the main crop seemed to be cucumbers.
And I remember one reference in one of the materials that I looked at the Historical Commission. It may have been Mr. Kendall. There was someone who was known as the Cucumber King.
That was Mr. Kendall.
Not just because of Leominster, but his products used to be shipped throughout the region. I guess to Boston, probably the Boston market, I'm imagining.
I had heard that Kendall was in Chicago at one point, and he was walking down the street and he passed a grocery store, and he looked in the window, and here was a basket of cucumbers. And he went in, he said, the clerk said, "May I help you?" And he said, "Well, if it isn't too much trouble, I'd like to see that basket of cucumbers closely." "Sure." And so they took the basket of cucumbers out, and he said, "Do you mind if I take some of them out?" And the store owner said, "Sure." So he took the cucumbers out, and on the bottom of the basket, there was a slip of paper said, "Grown by Kendall, Leominster, Massachusetts."
Leominster, Mass.
So he was quite pleased to find that.
We take for granted, and this is a big change, we have the global economy now, and we have things from all over the world, out of season, but it was different.
Certainly was.
What a difference. And my next question was the acquiring of food, clothing, supplies, and so on different from today? And it was when you were growing up as a child, but when you got to Leominster, this was post-World War II, when things were changing and things were more modern. Were there any different, what from the time you were a child to the time you got to Leominster, what were some of the other technological changes that you had witnessed?
Well, in communication and transportation, that comes to mind. Certainly every year sees improvements in communication and transportation.
Today we have cell phones, instant communication.
Correct.
Virtually throughout the world. Something happens on the other side of the world and we can view it while it's happening.
Correct.
So for any young members of the LATV audience, you take this communication, these advances for granted, but it wasn't always the case.
No, it was not.
And one wonders whether in the future what things will be like. I mean,
I don't try to look into the future. I'm just glad to be here.
When you were young, Keith, what were schools like? What were some of the changes that you have seen?
I think the classes were larger.
When you were a
Yes.
child? Yeah.
But in Leominster and in my hometown, there was nothing lacking in the education. In fact, I think today that teaching has so many aids to it, film strips and all the technological developments for a classroom. In those days, the teacher had to really teach.
Didn't have all the teachers, and my history, I am a retired teacher, and teachers really do work very hard and teach,
Yeah.
and they did in those days. But something very interesting you said, from my own experience, you said film strips. When I was a beginning teacher, film strips were used a lot. And now they're passé because they're
Right.
the videos and the DVDs.
Sure.
In fact, film strips, I think now, almost a collector's item.
Right.
In some cases.
And classes are much, much smaller.
The classes are smaller, and
I've seen pictures of George Street School with 42 students in a class, something like that. And the teachers did it all.
they did.
Yeah.
Did. Times were different, but many advances have been made in education. I have to put a plug in for the hardworking teachers and the hardworking students.
I remember Charlie Wheeler telling me that when he was in the home of the Historical Society, there were 2 classes in a room. And he started up there and he went through the first grade, and the teacher would switch from one group to another within the room. And after his first grade, the teacher promoted him to the 3rd. And again it happened. And then I think he got into the 5th grade, and he told me that his parents said, no more of that. You're getting beyond your age group.
Right, the social.
But that was probably something good about 2 classes in one room.
Now, the Charles Wheeler, I graduated with Gus Wheeler. Is this Gus Wheeler, Charles Augustus Jr., Dr. Wheeler's?
I was talking to
Gus, to
Gus's father.
Oh, Dr. Wheeler.
Yeah,
And
well,
Gus Wheeler is Dr. Wheeler
yeah.
too, but
And
Gus is
Charlie Wheeler was 3rd generation doctor.
Okay.
Yeah.
I graduated, went through junior high and high school with Gus. I call him Gus.
Yeah, he was quite a man. I admired Charlie Wheeler very much.
Yes, Dr. Wheeler was a long-time wonderful physician in Leominster, and that'll bring a lot of memories to the LATV audience.
You bet. I went down to the city council meeting. I was a councilor for 14 years.
Tell us something about that. I was going to mention that, but you were a Leominster City Councilor. Among your many accomplishments, you were there for 14 years.
Yes.
During which mayor's administrations? So we can
I started with LaPierre.
Mayor LaPierre.
Yes, yeah. And my service wasn't probably. It was a good thing. It wasn't continuous. Maybe I had a couple of years, and then an election I might have been defeated. But then I saw things not from the inside of the council, but as a private citizen. And I think that was a great benefit to occasionally see the council operate. And then I'd get back in the council, and so that was a great experience.
And so Mayor LaPierre, some of the other mayors that...
It was entirely different then, because you didn't have to have open meetings every time you got together. And I'll reveal a secret if it was a secret, but the mayor used to say, if you can come in on Monday noon, I want to talk about some of the appointments. So usually we would show up, and we'd go in the mayor's office, and the mayor would say, well, so-and-so, I was going to appoint to a commission or whatever, and I don't want to embarrass the man, and I'm going to bring his name in if the majority of you fellows say that you go along with it. And he'd say the name of the man, and we'd just have a minor discussion, and he'd say, okay, I'll bring that name in. But he said, I don't want to embarrass anyone, have them turned down.
Right, sensitive to the feelings of the person
so
who was possibly
he'd get a general impression of the council's feelings on that appointee. Right. And I think that was a good thing.
Yes.
But that was a closed meeting.
Yes, and now is the open, that was probably pre-open meeting law.
Yeah.
Now there's the open meeting.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned Mayor LaPierre. Was that the only, there must have been other mayors, Mayor Crosman?
Cormier.
Mayor Cormier.
Sure.
Mayor Laurie Cormier, okay.
And he was a practicing lawyer, and he didn't take a lot of time to be in City Hall all the time. He had a law practice, but he did very well.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Keith, some of your other accomplishments. Historian, you're very, very much interested. You were a member of the Leominster Historical
Commission?
Society?
Yes, both.
The society and the commission.
Yes.
So, so tell us something about that.
Well, I was 6 years in the presidency of the Historical Society.
Leominster Historical Society, which is a wonderful organization.
If I can claim an accomplishment, you remember, I'm sure, you must have been a child, when they had the historical section in the public library.
Yes. Go ahead.
And during my administration, I said, well, it doesn't seem to make sense to me that we can go over to the library and see some history or historical items, and then you can come over to the old school and see the Historical Society exhibits. So I said, why don't we combine the two? And I sounded out several people on it, and I saw the library then was quite crowded, and they needed more office space, and I suggested this to some of the library people, and they said, yeah, they'd give us more space. So there were a lot of things in there that were not part of the history of Leominster. Mounted birds and stones and souvenirs. In those days, the people that traveled would bring things back to Leominster, and that was good for its time. But I said, gee, if we could bring those exhibits over to the Historical Society, we'd have it all in one building, and the library would have more room. So I worked hard on that, and it was accomplished.
So that
Helped both institutions.
that was a great accomplishment, and that's a win-win situation. And that expression "win-win" is something new in the language, because in those days it wasn't. And I'm thinking of all these connections. When I was it must have been when I went to Lincoln School on Cross Street as a child, first through sixth grades. That must have been when we went on a field trip to the library, and one of my memories is going up the stairs to the library into that museum, and I remember the Civil War. There was a Civil War uniform, and I think I recall a piece of a hardtack which fascinated me.
Yes, I remember that.
Because it was from the Civil War. There was something that was still existed that could have been eaten by someone. It may still be over at the Historical Society.
It may have been.
So I think I never forgot that, and that may have been where I first saw that. But I know I visited that museum at the library. And another connection I'm thinking of is, you mentioned the birds and the stones and things, rocks. The Historical Commission has, and the LATV studio, the folks down at LATV have, well, Percy Johnson's, they're involved in a lot of restoration.
Yes.
And they have restored Percy Johnson's glass negatives. And and Edmund Davis was the early photographer, the pioneer photographer in Leominster, and I think it's Edmund Davis who was instrumental in founding the museum at the library. And those rocks and those birds may very well have been his, because he was a naturalist as well as a photographer.
Yes.
So all these interesting connections.
Right.
Getting back to Keith Lauer, and not Percy Johnson and Edmund Davis, but the downtown Leominster, you came to Leominster shortly after World War II. What was downtown Leominster like in those days? What are some of your recollections of Leominster downtown?
The big change was the traffic pattern in downtown, and that certainly changed. Increased traffic. Something had to be done.
Yes.
And it was done, and we benefited by some of those changes.
One of the major changes, and it generated a lot of controversy at the time, the Civil War monument was in the Rotary. There was a Rotary.
Yes.
And many of the people in the audience can recall the Rotary. It worked.
I remember the day they moved the monument.
And the monument had to be moved.
To go.
And you remember now where is the obelisk? Or I guess it's not officially an obelisk, but the Civil War monument has been moved into the Monument Square, into the common area.
Yes.
But you remember the day they
moved it. Yeah.
And now we have all the lights and so on that makes the traffic flow.
And I think we're probably reaching another crunch point. If you remember the traffic from the square backing up almost down to the Lancaster Street
in those
junction.
Yes. So more cars, more traffic.
Most houses have 2 cars.
Yes, in some cases even more.
Yeah.
Some of the other changes, interestingly, someone the other day called, and I spoke to someone on the phone, and they had spoken about one of the fixtures downtown was, I guess, the Boston Confectioners, the BC. And tell us something about things you remember of the businesses and the restaurants and so on downtown.
Well, I think at that time there were more independent merchants downtown, not part of a chain. And gradually we've come to have many chain enterprises.
Franchises and chains.
Yes, that's a big change. And in those days, you went into a store and the communication with the store personnel was very good.
Yes.
They knew what you wanted, where to find it.
And you got waited on.
You bet. And they would impart their knowledge of the product and how it was used.
And you didn't have to go searching around for someone to wait on you.
No, you didn't. No.
That's a change,
right.
In some of the, the bigger stores.
Exactly.
Searstown, formerly Searstown, the mall at Whitney Field now. How things change.
Yes.
The mall that wasn't there when you came to town.
Oh, certainly not.
No.
Certainly not. And I'm sure you probably remember the swimming pool down there.
I worked for the in the summers for the recreation department, and I frequently went down.
I have some pictures of that pool down there.
Yeah, the beautifully maintained swimming pool, and the adult pool and the kids pool.
Yeah, but there was an awful lot of vandalism.
Yes,
down there.
that's what eventually one of the things that. Yes.
But that was great for the children of that French Hill neighborhood.
Yes, and it has since been that area of the city, the pool, and recently. I recently interviewed Vern Brito, your colleague on the council,
right.
And I think Vern was instrumental. Had a lot to do with getting a pool in the southeast section of Leominster, which
certainly they deserved that.
Yes,
and it was
well
patronized.
Yes, and it's very well patronized.
Yeah.
So. A lot of the city councilors, they continue to serve Vern and you in many capacities. You give of yourselves, and that comes through.
I think through that service, I had 14 years on the council, and a friend of mine, a female friend, says, you know more about Leominster than a lot of people that have lived here all of their lives.
It's true.
And I said, well, I think the city council service had something to do with my familiarity with the city.
One of the things I remember associated with you, friends of mine had a son who was involved in scouting, and you one day came down to the Southeast School and spoke to his scout troop about Buckskin Sam.
Buckskin.
And so your knowledge of Leominster history. Tell us a little bit about, I know this, I'm just springing this on you now.
That's all right.
We didn't talk about this in the anteroom, but tell us a little bit about Buckskin Sam.
Well, Sam Hall, and I guess his parents were farmers up near the
Old Leominster High, Carter.
Well, yes, beyond the point of land up there. And you've probably heard stories about Buckskin Sam and some of his visitors coming to Leominster.
Yes.
And how he worked on the trains, hawking the little storybooks.
Dime novels.
Dime novels, yes, yes. And that was quite a romantic story. He traveled so much and so far, and I, like you, probably enjoyed that very much. Yeah.
So for those of you in the LATV audience who want to know more about Buckskin Sam, you can consult the Leominster Historical Society. He was Texas, I think he was involved with the Texas Rangers.
I think I've read someplace where Davy Crockett came over with him to visit in Leominster. They had been companions.
Kit Carson or one of those. I think it was Kit Carson.
Kit Carson.
Yeah, and tented out up by his homestead up.
Kit Carson couldn't stand a bedroom and the
Right,
confinement of that. He wanted to be out in the open.
So it's a fascinating character, Buckskin Sam.
Yes.
You had mentioned Viscaloid, formerly Viscaloid, which then became the DuPont, and you are an expert. And I'm going to hold up, if you could hand me that book, Keith.
Oh, yes.
Please. You had mentioned that you are, and you've coined this word, you are a plastorian.
That was my self-made title.
Self-made title. What is a plastorian, please?
I think it tells you as someone interested in history of plastics.
History of plastics.
And that's a big part of our community history.
Of the community of Leominster, the history.
Right.
And we're not going to go into this in detail today, but this is the subject of another program. I'm holding up a book which Keith has co-authored. It's Keith, would you read the title, please?
Celluloid, a collector's reference and value guide.
And Keith has a large collection of plastics items dealing with the history of the plastics industry in general, and particularly in Leominster.
Particularly, but I have plastic items from all over, an awful lot of Japanese plastic items. And their processes in Japan are much like our early processes for blow molding. And I was fortunate enough to go to Japan, and I have several videos of plastic production in Japan. I have also traveled into Oyonnax, France, and visited the plastic museums over there. In fact, when I went over to, both Japan and Oyonnax, France, I left some of my small viscaloid items, animals, if you will, for their exhibits. So you'll find some of Keith Lauer's collection distributed between Japan and Oyonnax, France.
So that will be, we hope, quite possibly a topic we'll get, if Keith will be kind enough to come in again.
Be glad to.
And we'll do a program on the plastics industry and his vast knowledge of the plastics industry, particularly in Leominster.
Mm-hmm.
And he is really, I think, one of the first official plastorian I have ever interviewed. So that should be a very interesting, worthwhile interview.
Try to make it that.
I'm sure it will be, Keith. Keith, we talked like downtown, some of the changes, the pre-mall era. What are some of the other changes you observed in the ways the citizens of Leominster make a living? And as a follow-up, do you recall any major manufacturing concerns that are no longer here?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is the Viscaloid.
The huge Viscaloid.
Employed about 2,000 people. And I used to say that we've lost two large employers, the Viscaloid and Foster Grant.
Foster Grant. And I hope someday to do a program on Foster,
the industry.
The industry, Foster Grant. We've done one on, we had some of the employees, former employees of DuPont, Viscaloid.
Yes. And I remember that distinctly. Pardon me for interrupting, but we all know of Viscaloid and the buildings that were visible along Lancaster Street. But your aerial views taken by, I believe it was Arthur Bedoin, recently showed me the extent of the DuPont complex back from
Yes.
Lancaster Street, looking down into the trees, and I want to get a copy of that sometime.
Well, I'll make sure that you do. And we had Mr. Emil Brosso came in. He was a long-time employer, a fine gentleman, and he knew so much about DuPont, and we did an interview with him on DuPont, and we showed that picture, and it's an amazing picture, the extent of the DuPont Doyle work,
from
the
the
depth.
street.
And again, we hope to do the other end of the city, another major employer, Foster Grant,
Yes.
and we have some Arthur Bedoin photos of that, which we'll perhaps show. The Water Tower Plaza, how things change.
Yeah.
Many residents new to Leominster have no idea why the Water Tower Plaza is called the Water Tower Plaza, but we'll show you the picture which shows the water tower in
Arthur
the factory.
Bedoin left a great legacy to Leominster in the aerial photographs, and I remember one of St. Cecilia's Church taken from the air.
Yes.
And those are very, very valuable things.
The Historical Commission has Mr. Bedoin's collection of aerial photographs, prints, and almost every time I go to the commission office in the Gallagher building, I refer to those prints, and there are so many of them. They're so fascinating. And the LA TV studios have been working restoring many of his negatives.
Right.
And we'll be organizing them. So again, we express our appreciation to LA TV for all the work in restoration and preservation that they've been doing. One of the things we want to do, these connections, we want to, since we're all interested in Leominster history, the Historical Society, the Commission, LATV, and the Leominster Library, we want to all collaborate and work together, not at cross purposes.
Exactly.
Because I've mentioned this many times before, don't put your eggs all in one basket. There have been so many fires in Leominster in this irreplaceable history. We want it to be spread out so that, and duplicated, so that it won't be lost for future generations in Leominster.
Very good effort.
Keith, some of your other recollections of changes in Leominster, things you've seen, some of your service in Leominster. I know you were instrumental in the Leominster, the National Plastics Museum, and you dedicated many years of service there. Some of the other things that, what are some of your fond memories of growing up in your hometown, early youth, and here? Tell us share something about that, please.
Well, I became interested in history in my hometown because that was the first settlement in the Northwest Territory, and it was at the confluence of the Ohio River and the Muskingum River. And
this is sounding like Abe Lincoln here.
well, I can't believe that I have seen all this, but the early settlers of Marietta, Ohio, largely came from the Ipswich, Massachusetts area. And you had Johnny Appleseed here in Leominster, and at a young age, Johnny Appleseed and his family moved further west, and they finally went up Duck Creek near Marietta. And my mother told me up around Dexter City and Macksburg, there were quite a few Chapmans up there. And so that was the connection. And my mother was a Warren, and when she used to come over to visit me, she would go over to Shirley Center in the cemetery there and do genealogical research. And she was quite a historian herself. She loved the history of her family from New England.
And so that's probably where you
that
got...
whetted the interest.
That whetted the interest in
history. And then we
history.
had a big museum in Marietta. It's operated by the state now, but they had the first settlement in Marietta, in the first settlement in the Northwest Territory, and they built a brick enclosure over the first settlement in Marietta. Brick and steel windows, so that it was forever protected from the elements.
So this small settlement, that they've preserved it.
Yeah, yeah. And I used to visit, well, it was Campus Martius. Marietta's a very historic community, and they have Mound Cemetery. And that was the work of the mound builders, which preceded the Indian civilization. And there was a moat around this big mound. And Mound Cemetery is a prominent part of the city of Marietta. And I've heard there were more Revolutionary War officers buried there than any place else in the country, because they received land grants in the Ohio Territory for their services as officers in the Army. And so I knew Earl Tupper well, and I told Earl Tupper that...
Now, Earl Tupper of Tupperware?
Yes.
What's the is there a Leominster connection? I know there is. But...
Well, Marietta had, I told Earl, and I sent him a postcard of the cemetery, and there was a Colonel Tupper buried there, which was one of his ancestors. That was the connection.
The connection, and for the LATV audience who probably have Tupperware at home, what's the connection between Earl Tupper and Leominster? Tupperware, he has a Leominster.
Oh, he came from Shirley.
Came from Shirley.
But he operated out of Leominster for many, many years.
The pioneer plastic city.
And then finally, they moved to Clinton.
Moved to Clinton.
From Leominster.
Manufacturing in Clinton.
Earl Tupper was in the basement of the religious item shop up there on Tremaine Street.
Tremaine Street, Buckley's.
Yeah,
Buckley's. Oh, I didn't realize that. So there's a Tupperware connection to off Tremaine Street to Buckley's Religious Articles, where it's a manufacturing plant. I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Next time I go in there, I'm going to...
Yeah, I think Earl had machinery in the basement. And I know they had comb cutters down there, and I don't know whether the Buckley boys have gotten rid of that or not, but I think by this time they may have taken some of those old machines out.
All of these, you learn more, and the more I...
one of my friends said, "You didn't come from here, but you know more about Leominster than I
you certainly
learned."
You certainly do.
But I had an inquiring mind, and I still have it.
Keith, nearing the end of our interview, and again, I want to say that there's going to be a future one, and where we'll focus in.
Well,
I'm not going to tell the audience that under the table. This is between. Everybody, our audience, don't listen. But under the table, there, Keith brought in a box of just a few of items from his collection. We're not going to show them to you today, but at a subsequent interview, we will go into, and it'll be strictly on your knowledge of the plastics industry and your expertise, and if you'll be kind enough, I'm sure you will bring in some of the items from your wonderful collection.
Very dear to me.
I can tell that you are indeed a plastorian.
I was. I am.
You still
in my
are.
own mind.
You are, and you always will be. To conclude our interview, Keith, what are one or two, and this is always one of the hardest questions because there are so many fond memories, but from growing up back home or back here in Leominster, which is your home now, what can you share with us about some of your fondest memories?
Well, there are a great many. Although I grew up in Marietta, Ohio, I went to college in Alabama. And that was an entirely different culture for me at that time. And people say, oh, my son in Leominster is going to school in Fitchburg State College. Well, that's a fine institution.
Yes.
But I think a large part of going to college is getting away from your present environment into a different culture. And that happened to me when I went to Alabama. And my roommate down there was Frankie Giamarco from Brattleboro. And he was a great boy, but it was a shock to him to get down there. And we were down there for 2 years together, and I took Frankie home with me one Christmas in Ohio. And we got up to Cincinnati, and he said, "Why are the people walking so fast?" and that was an obvious difference between the North and the South. And I think part of everyone's education is getting away from Leominster, wherever, into a different area and a different culture. And that's very educational. I know it was for me.
Yeah.
And I love Leominster now.
I can tell.
Yeah.
I can tell. Keith, I want to thank you.
Well, it's been my privilege to share some of my experiences and my thoughts of Leominster and life in Leominster.
And you did.
And the changes I've seen.
And
I can't believe that I've reached this age, but I make the most of it, and I hope to. Well, I'm aiming for many more years.
Well, God bless you. God bless you. Keith, I want to thank you. I want to thank you, and we look forward to our next visit.
Yes.
And I want to thank, as always, I want to thank Carl Pimerini, Jack Sully, Kevin Moran, Dennis Cormier, and as always, you, the LATV viewing audience, for tuning in to Neighborhood Snapshot.
Well, I will add my congratulations to these gentlemen for bringing us this opportunity. And it's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Keith.
And we'll see you later.
Okay, take care.